First of all, can I say it's a real privilege to be here and to participate in discussion. I often describe the In the Zone conference as Perth's quite significant contribution to the national intellectual debate, particularly around policy. It's very important. When I agreed to participate in the white paper process, I said it was very important for the white paper process to be much more than a Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, I often call that the Bermuda Triangle, where things just get lost. It was really important for the committee to get out and actually spend time talking in other parts of Australia. And the reality, when you look at the In the Zone piece, of course, is it's just startling. And of course, Premier Barnett will talk about it, as he can talk about it with ease, just the depth and the nature of the relationship between this great state and more broadly with Asia. And it's to our peril that we don't understand the interrelationships that already exist here. And it would have been a huge mistake to presume that we understood all that sitting around in a table in Canberra. So we're very engaged in getting out, talking to other parts of the country, but also importantly talking to regional Australia and also talking to people who often don't get talked to or actually have their opinions asked. And maybe later on in Q&A we'll talk a little bit about how the white paper's landed and how it's settling. Anyway, the topic that I want to chat about with you is cross-cultural leadership and literacy in the 21st century. And I suppose I don't want to give you a definition of literacy in that context, but I thought what I'd do is talk about it in the way in which we, in the task force accompanying the white paper, we're talking about it. So we're talking about an ability to speak the language, but obviously that's not all. A knowledge of the history, again not all, customs and culture. Literacy can come from a lengthy period of time in the country, on the ground, and an ability to get something done in the country, so knowing how to get it done. This is all being literate in a way. These are all good examples, and of course there's many more, but I'm trying to encapsulate there. It's much more than a definition from a dictionary. There's lots of different combinations of these types of literacy that can occur in cross-cultural understanding. I want to talk a little bit about the capabilities and simplify it a little bit by trying to focus on it mainly from the business sector point of view. And the sorts of things that we discerned and then recommended around, and those of you who've waded through the 300 pages beyond the executive summary, I think would see this coming through very clearly, is that what we were saying is that we need to build national and Asia-relevant capabilities throughout our society. They shouldn't be kept in wonderful, imprisoned environments. They needed to permeate more broadly. There needed to be a national conversation, for a start, about Asia. And they need to be more broadly than just for business. It actually has to be in the public sector. It actually go through our educational institutions and across the community. We actually thought, and I fervently believe, by the way, that Australians deserved a discussion about Asia. And I know there's a bit of a habit for a number of people to say, well, we already knew all that. But you know, for a lot of people in our communities, what they see and feel happening to them is something that they deserve to be involved with and understand the process and the challenges. And in many respects, one of the most important features of the white paper is to lay out irrefutably what is going on in Asia and the relevance to Australia. And in doing so, building up knowledge is actually quite useful. I'll go into that later on about how that fits in with cross-cultural issues. We also need to build and reinvent many of our institutions that can provide a range of capabilities, because even if we could define what we thought literacy or cross-cultural literacy is right now, it's no doubt going to be different in 10 years' time. So I won't be brave enough to come up with a single answer for literacy. What I'll do is try and give you my viewpoint on it as it pertains to business and diplomacy right now. My view, and in fact it very much comes picking up what Joseph said in the earlier session. I found that a fascinating insight into the way in which he saw business models developing as well in Asia. But something I saw, and also just listening to you, Matt, as well, that building cross-cultural leadership and literacy actually comes out of trust and relationships. It's not actually out of putting bricks and mortar in offices and around Asia. It's actually about trust and relationships. So if we are to live in an Asian century, we need to acknowledge the different ways different countries think about trust and relationships. In an Asian context, and I'm using a very general term, notions of trust and relationships have developed under differing systems of law and governance from ours. And picking up the discussion of Joseph before, I think that is something that we don't quite understand yet. We all think it's moving to what we think is an acceptable norm, but it may not emerge as we may like it to, and we certainly may not emerge in a way that we may have organised ourselves to deal with it. And in many cases, trust and relationships play roles we leave to the legal system in Australia. A good example of this, for those of you who've been involved in what we call contract enforcement. People don't rely so much on the law, but often on trust and relationships to resolve issues. But there are also many cultural elements, concepts of gift exchange, ideas of power which can be different, understanding the role of the spiritual life. I mean, Matt, you live in India, and of course one of the most important issues in trying to understand business dealings in India is also to understand the spiritual dimension that's attached to that. And that's actually difficult for a lot of people to understand that it's not just one spiritual dimension. We're talking about thousands of different trays that will be operating through one country with many, many different systems. There are just three examples. But they're seminal to building trust and relationships in the region. I think all of us here would have at least one example of committing a social faux pas in a cross-cultural environment. I think that, if we don't admit that, I think we're deluding ourselves. But one of the things I often find very interesting is that people, when they look at cross-cultural issues, tend to force themselves or force the argument into, but we're all the same, aren't we? Whereas I think one of the first steps in cross-cultural understanding is to actually understand the differences. When we talk about family and community, what does that mean in a particular province in China? Does it mean the same thing that we expect it to mean? So understanding the differences are actually important, and that's the essence really of cross-cultural understanding. So trust and relationship will come from engagement and from greater contact. So as part of talking about literacy, I'll talk a bit about engagement, about how we can engage better. So each context is different, and it's hard to give generalisable principles that cover cross-cultural interactions. But greater knowledge of each other, of different environments, of different ways of working, of different national ambitions, of different ways of thinking, will always make us better at working in cross-cultural environments. Now, we may find becoming more literate in other cultures challenging, but we actually have a lot of advantages to build on. We already have a lot of shared relationships through trade and investment, and that was our friend from ANZ was talking about that earlier as I came in. But we also have many assets. We know almost a third of Australians are overseas born, for example, and around 10% of Australians are of Asian origin. And you may be interested to know that I've become a bit of a rock star amongst Australians of Asian origin. My email has been littered by thank you notes from Australians of Asian origin who are delighted that in the white paper on Australia in the Asian century, their contribution to this nation is recognised and valued and actually something that can be seen to be built upon. It's actually very interesting. It's not something that I thought about as a consequence of the work that I was doing, but it actually has enlivened a bridge for a number of people to feel that they can participate more fully in Australian society. And of course, many Asian business people, diplomats, military leaders and policymakers are and were educated in Australia, and we see that time and time again. Not to mention the constant and visible impacts of immigration on our society, our culture, our entertainment. We actually now have visible Buddhism, we have visible Islam in Australia. We have an understanding of K-pop, of J-pop. We're actually starting to understand these movements that are occurring elsewhere. You know, how many people sit here and think about Taiwan and the particular strength it has in bicycle making, the dominance of Giant when you talk about cycling, about the Design Week in Beijing, about the Goma Triennial on Asian Art in Queensland, which, by the way, is the most important triennial of Asian art in the world. The fact that the largest concentration of Asian-focused academics is actually in the world is actually at the Australian National University. We actually already have lots of assets that we can build upon. So even though it's challenging, we do have things that can push us along. Yet, of course, there's much more we can be doing to improve our cross-cultural leadership. We've made some investments in building Asian literacy over the years, but these assets are no longer adequate to the task. For example, and we make this point in the white paper, and this is something that's commented upon ceaselessly, and so it's not an original thought, but it is backed up with facts. Our ranks of linguists, historians and area specialists have dwindled in some areas over time. And even if we bolster our ranks in one specific area, Asia remains one region, but as Jeff said, many countries. We need capabilities that can work across different environments, cultures, financial systems and legislative bodies. So we need programs not just for any one single area, and this of course is where the Asian Century White Paper, I think, makes a useful contribution to public policy debate. We start talking about frameworks. We need frameworks that make collaboration and interaction across many cultures easier and better. Those frameworks should be at the heart of a lot of the public policy reform as we seek to push towards having one of the outcomes sought in the white paper of 10 universities in the top 100 by 2025. So parts of these shifts will need to come from our existing institutions. So this is one reason, one of many reasons, of course, that I'm very glad to be here today at UWA, which of course has not only got an Asian Studies program and a program examining many of the major countries of the region, but has also just added a specialist program on Korean. But we need our institutions to continue to reinvent themselves and develop greater capabilities. But one of the points that we must insist upon is that our institutions must learn to work better together. Collaboration will be key, leveraging off the existing knowledge and assets we have invested in for many, many years is important. So to pick language as an example, if you want to study Korean, you should be able to have access to that capability not only through primary school, but through high school, university, and then your workplace. Support for this institutionally should encompass this range, but it does not at the moment. So that's how we need to start thinking about these things. Most cross-cultural shifts will rely on the many talents of our people. We've got a highly skilled, I think not yet contaminated, hard-working and creative population. Of course, no one works harder than the partners of Corrs Chambers Westgarth in Perth. We've got the intellectual property frameworks and traditions to allow us to make the most of all this talent. And we've got world-class schools and world-leading research institutions in education, health, environmental management, science and design. But we don't have enough. And we'll need to make much more of our population, more than a quarter of whom were born overseas, and of course our large diaspora. As I said earlier, familiarity can help to build social, business and cultural networks, and there are an enormous amount of unanticipated benefits that can flow from more contact and what I call connectivity. And for me, of course, I believe that the source of power and influence in the 21st century is actually connectivity, interconnectedness. And of course, that is one of the great opportunities for Australia to really leverage off the connectivity we already have and make much more of that. So a wide range of groups, broadening out the conversation, broadening out the people involved in developing up our opportunities, from businesses to unions to community groups to even sports teams. In fact, you might be amused to know that just as I was getting up on stage, I received an email from a group in Indonesia of Australian Indonesians who were sitting down to work out how, because they saw a reference to sport in the white paper, how they can take that forward as a connected link up between Australia and Indonesia. That's the kind of level of thinking that's going on outside some of the hallowed public policy for it. People are actually trying to work out how to get involved. Of course, because one of the most important things is that the long-term benefits of these interactions are often overlooked. We are well aware of the benefits of having greater knowledge. I mean, we sit today in a university, and of course that's one of the keys. Greater knowledge of other cultures is very important. But I think we sometimes miss the long-term benefits of good cross-cultural interactions. There are many long-term, unanticipated benefits that come from having engagement across different levels of society. Today's students, tourists, or friends from the region can be tomorrow's cultural or business partners in the age of collaboration. And the benefits from these partnerships can spread across lifetimes. And in the end, one of the most important elements in thinking about the region and our role is how do we generate more goodwill? And of course, in my case, some of which we can monetize. But how do we generate more goodwill is key. How do we become participants in the great Asian discussions and dialogues? Benefits will only increase as our region becomes a greater source of ideas, expertise and technology for Australia. And this actually involves a mindset shift for Australians as well. A major benefit of the Asian century for Australia will be our ability to work together with Asia to make the most of their new ideas. I mean, how many of us do know that design is now one of the most important elements of the Chinese go-forward plan? It's actually a focused area for the future. Design principles and the argument, can you have a design-based community in the midst of an authoritarian regime? It's actually some very interesting challenges, but it's part of it. How many of us know that South Korea, Seoul, in fact, is most famous, looking at business at the moment, around internet gaming, these sorts of issues? How many of us know, for example, in India, that India has actually been greatly successful at not only producing exceptional publications of scientific papers, but has also had success opening up new markets for high technology through what's called frugal innovation. such as water filters using silver that need no electricity or moving parts. Ideas such as this, of course, will be a boon to the Indian economy and Indian society, and potentially to Australian investors, inventors and instructors. But getting access to these sorts of ideas requires, by definition, a high level of cross-cultural literacy and leadership, openness, curiosity and engagement. Anachronistic thinking in this regard is very dangerous. Maintaining contemporaneous engagement is key. So while we need to engage more with our external environment, we need to keep playing to our strengths as well. We need to keep our house in order. We have fabulous built assets, our governance systems, our highly developed rule of law, and importantly, I think, our free media, our robust multicultural society, and even from time to time our cricket team, are role models to many in the region. And I think they'll only continue to be role models as the Asian middle class grows, which, as we know, it will enormously. There are expected to be around 3 trillion middle-class people in the countries in the Asian century. 10 times that of every other region in the world except for Europe, and even then 5 times as many as Europe. So keeping our own house in order and reinforcing the things we already do well will be the best way to make us more attractive to our neighbours as they become more middle class. Continuing the push for economic reform is critical to keeping our house in order. And I know, and I'm sure, though I wasn't here, that Michael Chaney would have talked about that this morning. And of course, attracting the best and the brightest here and the best and the brightest moving abroad as well, whether it be to study, visit or live, will greatly increase cross-cultural literacy because this gives us a greater incentive to learn more about each other. So using our other natural advantages can help with cross-cultural literacy too. We have an advantage over the Northern Hemisphere in that we have a proximity advantage and we work in largely the same time zone. As this conference so aptly notes, 60% of the world's population lives in the same time zone as Australia's west coast. Time zones similarities will particularly benefit services sectors, and of course the Australian services sector is one of the most robust in the world and actually constitutes something like 70% plus of the Australian economy. The zone, the time zone, the region is actually good for services. But it will also help people-to-people contact and will help build familiarity, which of course helps, what I said before, trust. Now, one of the things we heard before in the previous panel was some of the challenges around the capital markets, particularly in the region. Greater investment in both directions would be of great benefit, but actually requires regional calibration, and Australia has a role to play here. At present, we trade heavily and invest scarcely in the region we live in. Recent estimates have it that 50% of our trade is with Asia, but only 5% of our investment is. And this pattern, by the way, is the same for most Asian countries as well, in the region as a whole. Far greater progress has been made with free trade than with the transfer of funds. We've done quite well on market access, but we've done pretty poorly on market integration. Investment brings a different array of challenges for cross-cultural management, but it can also bring greater rewards and build lasting relationships both now and in the future. We need to ensure that possible investors in Australia are kept feeling as welcome as possible. We need to continue to support an open economy. We need to continue to welcome foreign capital. And we need to encourage more Australians to go out and invest in Asia, but not just exhort people to do so. We need to work together with our friends in Asia to build greater confidence in the regional financial services sector and market. There are proposals I'm working through at APEC Business Advisory Council. I recently presented to the APEC finance ministers in Moscow and then to the leaders in Vladivostok with an idea of the development of an Asia-Pacific Financial Forum. Of course, you know there's not one place in Australia where regulators, reserve banks, international financial institutions, business, academics, talk about the implications for the failure to actually move ahead to development capital markets, the pent-up demand on infrastructure. There's something like trillions and trillions of demand on infrastructure, and yet there's only $366 billion worth of allocated capital. How do we deepen the capital markets? How do we improve the frameworks around the financial sector to enable that capital to actually emerge? How do we build the frameworks around public-private partnerships, etc.? This is all about how do we continue to invest in the growth of Asia. It's us participating in those great debates. And this idea has been signed off by the leaders. There'll be a symposium which will cast out what the scope will be for the financial forum, and it will take place in Sydney in March. The exciting prospect here, again, is that Australia will be part of engaging with the rest of the region as we seek to deal with an issue which matters to them. And that, for me, will test our literacy, but actually, as we work our way through it, I think will show us even a stronger future together. Thank you.
John. Thanks very much, John. That could be described as the white paper Denton style, perhaps.
It's much shorter.
That's right. John, actually, just before I'd like to throw to the audience, because there's been some good discussion points come up here, but just on the symposium for March, John, why hasn't that taken place under the existing umbrella of different institutional frameworks that we have already, and do we need another one, actually, with respect?
Well, it's actually not another one. It's a first. If you take a step back and look at the correlation of the growth in Asia, and so I'll just use one regional piece of architecture, which was APEC, which most of us are pretty well familiar with. APEC actually had as its goal for many, many years this whole issue of market access. So it was all about the Bogor goals, about lowering tariffs, etc. But as we've gone on and working with the region, what's become much more important now is what's called behind the border reform, which is really about integration. So it's actually moving, as I said, from market access to market integration. And the challenging thing there is that having thought through the next big agenda for APEC, which is regional economic integration, people suddenly realised that the piece that was actually missing here was some deep thinking about the regional financial architecture. Why is it that more capital leaves the region than comes into it? Clearly one of the issues goes to behind the border reforms. And of course, services negotiations, from my point of view, well, I don't want to get too technical about it. I'll be incredibly technical, so they're a waste of time in this region, because in the end, services are actually around domestic reforms, and domestic reforms are actually political issues. So, as you can understand, creating an environment for financial markets reform in these regions is not something you can negotiate. You actually have to work at it. Work at it, and creating an environment in which it becomes possible, and issues which are now relevant to the region didn't exist before. A classic here, and was discussed on before, understanding the nature of this region. SMEs and SMMEs are the predominant factor if you actually pull together the whole economy and look at what actually makes it operate. That's the largest group that operates here. That's actually not the same in other regions in the world. So when you look at Basel III, one of the things you'd say, well, there are actually not a lot of thinking around some of the implications for the prognostications of the nomes of Zurich and Brussels about the implications for growth in Asia Pacific, because in a way there hasn't been anything organised to talk about it. So a classic a downside that occurred was on trade finance, which is actually the meat and potatoes of SME trade. Trade finance, that's actually how a lot of trade actually goes on. So what are the brilliant guys in the Northern Hemisphere decide? They've decided to weight the risk on trade finance at the same level as complex derivatives. So the first outcome of that is it limits their supply and increases their cost. So of course the cost in Asia is it becomes more expensive to trade, and therefore its capacity to actually hurt the SMEs, which are the fundamental driving force. Now the economies of Asia realise this, and now there's a reason to start doing something about it, as there is with infrastructure as well. But turning the discussion from we've got to have services negotiation into how do we drive domestic reform requires people to find some mutual interest, and these sorts of things are actually enabling that to happen. And of course, one of the nice things is that despite the criticism, in fact, of APEC, which is voluntary and consensual, it actually, if you deconstruct it, it's probably its greatest strength.
And interestingly too, would you say even the GFC promoted more cross-border cooperation within Southeast Asia on trade finance because the Europeans and Wall Street kind of pulled out of the region?
Yeah.
So you're seeing
well, I think you've also got for the first time, and this is where, I mean, look, you know, you can have very dry arguments about global architecture and regional architecture, etc. But, you know, the important piece of the G20 was the emergence of an Asian caucus within it. We can actually think about it. Indonesia, importantly, is in the G20, and obviously Australia. Korea is in the G20. And so there's actually an opportunity for the first time for some direct influence on these sorts of issues.
Okay, let me just look out across the audience here, see if there's any questions forthcoming. Nothing yet. Matt, maybe you could just pull together for us some of your speech in a sort of day-to-day situation in your life in India. In terms of doing business and how you see the landscape there. And we had the privilege of your company last night, and you were again talking about this trust issue, particularly in India.
And I think that's, it's an opportunity for people in Perth. It's a risk to you doing business in other parts of the zone. I think my colleague from China and I were talking last night about trust has three components in the meta-analyses. It has expertise, integrity, and benevolence. And all three, there's variation in all three of those in India and many other countries I've worked in the zone. The expertise, in India we've got the Nobel Prize winning types, and we've got these amazing guys I get to work for at Infosys, and then we've got, massive literal illiteracy. Most of the country who votes can't read and write. And how do they vote? They vote with pictures. So on the expertise, massive variation, and the distribution is quite skewed such that there's not so many of the Nobel Prize winners, and there's a whole lot of the illiterate. On the integrity, it's almost a cultural norm in many places. It's absolutely squeaky clean where I work. Unlike we heard earlier today that most companies in the zone have family members. Not true. Infosys is the only large multinational in India with no family members. So all my succession is more similar to probably how it happens in Australia and North America and Europe than it would be in other Indian companies. But integrity is basically very, very at risk, and many, if any of you have traveled to India, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's difficult to find people who will do what they say they're going to do. And the last one is they might have all the expertise in the world, they might be very conscientious and prudent and do what they say, but are they going to direct it in your direction? Do you trust that it's going to be invested, if you invest in the relationship, that'll be reciprocated to you? So all three of those I think are important as we think about selecting leaders, growing leaders throughout the region, becoming literate in all these things. They have cultural nuances, but at their core they're still human. And so for me, the bioinspiration stuff is just a fresh way to think about how other disciplines have dealt with it, and can it highlight good stuff we already do, or give us creative ideas about making that better.
Okay. Any more questions out there? No. Alana, yeah. So just in case no one heard that, a question was about the volume and scale of training and educational training that Infosys offers.
Infosys hires 30 to 50,000 people a year, most of them in India, and all of the new ones, they all come to where I am in Mysore for 6 months. They're paid, and by the time they're done, they're at the undergraduate kind of US standard computer science education. However, we also focus a lot on values, because they've grown up, they've never seen anything remotely like the 300-acre campus where we are. It's a gorgeous place. I call it the Taj Mahal of South India, because it's quite ornate in contrast to what you might have seen in other parts of India. And we pay a lot of attention to teaching them our values. English, really basic English skills are missing. Basic work-related values are often missing. They're usually the first generation that have gone to college. And I don't ever see those folks until they're very, very senior. So I only look after the board and our senior-most leaders who will someday be in those destination jobs. But it's a huge resource. And although we have huge gaps in women at the top, we only have one woman on our board and just a handful at the senior-most levels, we're almost at 50% at the junior-most ranks of women and men in engineering professions, which is good for the future in terms of the future leadership.
Well, just before we wrap up, John, I might just put to you finally this on the white paper again, and some of them, I guess, more discordant notes that came out. I mean, we have heard from business leaders, particularly around the white paper, that isn't it more about just us focusing on getting our own economic framework right, and everything else will look after itself? But you said earlier that Australians really deserve the white paper, and is that because there is concern that really the debate around the dramatic changes that we're going to see in terms of investment coming into this country and ownership of land, not traditionally from the Anglosphere, that's creating some xenophobia, or so in that sense, is it a political document that we've created with the white paper?
I must have hadn't framed it that way, but well, let's face it, we've just come off a dramatic terms of trade shock. There's actually been, I think, an implication and a consequence of that for the population throughout Australia. And a lot of people are trying to make sense of what's going on. And in many respects, having a long discussion with them about what's going on, rather than just telling them to suck it up and just get used to it, and there's going to be more change, it's going to be good for you, to actually take people through quite a lengthy discussion about what it is we need to do, why we need to keep changing. This is the upside. This is the context in which you're operating. I think is a decent part of a functioning democracy, and I don't mean politician-led democracy. It's about all the citizens. Well, not. I mean, I'm exaggerating. The fact is, not all citizens are fascinated by this, but there's an opportunity for citizens to get involved and to form opinions about these sorts of things with some really good data. There is no doubt that there is that the issue of an open economy is not a settled fact. I mean, we might sit around in these halls here and say, well, of course it should be. An open economy is good for the country and good for the future. It needs to be constantly argued, and in many respects it needs to be constantly put in the real context, or the new context in which we're operating. And clearly the opportunity and the challenges for Australia in the Asian century need to be better understood. And the other piece, of course, and this is where the tension was, and actually Paul Kelly wrote about this, I think, quite well. There were competing ambitions at play here. One of the challenges, of course, was the dramatic scale of the change that had taken place just in terms of foreign investment. I mean, you've gone from a period, the numbers are wrong, but the magnitudes are correct, in 2001 when there was $4 to $5 billion worth of Chinese direct investment to $34 billion to 38 billion. This is a very big
proportion,
change.
Though, isn't it? Really,
yeah, but it's actually it's a noticeable shift. And where our policy frameworks are well understood. I mean, there was an adjustment to policy frameworks on the way through, when perhaps a better response might have been a more market-based, market-focused response, and certainly a much more jawboning about these sorts of things. Have we actually got the leadership right about the relationships with some of these key economies? So the white paper does cry out and call out on these sorts of issues, and hopefully that's something that will inform a better discussion around opportunities, but also the need for continuing domestic economic reform.
Well said, John. So, look, can you please give your thanks to a fantastic panel discussion here with Matt Barney and John Denton. Thank you.